And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have Dr. Clare Craig. And it's been like a lifetime since she was with us. Claire, really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting me back on, Peter. Nice to be here.
Always good, always good. And of course, people can follow you. That is your X handle, and your book Expired, COVID the Untold Story. I know I had Claire on discussing that back when it was published, I think near the end of 2013. The links are all in the description for you to click on and get hold of your copy. Now, Claire, there was something that happened earlier this month, and it was at the Reform Party conference, and it was Malhotra, who has, I think, become well known to all of us. And maybe I'll give a little bit of background. There was I think the title that stuck with me was Reform UK has distanced himself from a conference speaker who suggested that COVID vaccines were linked to the King's and the Princess of Wales cancer. And it goes in that he actually shared a message from Angus Dalgleish, and Angus had shared his concerns, and we've had Professor Dalgleish on a number of times about the link between the vaccines and cancer. And of course, this was the shocking revelation from Asim Malhotra that it could have contributed to the cancers in the royal family. Do you want to let us know a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Okay, that's quite a big topic to tackle in some ways. Um, I think that science and medicine and politics are not good bedfellows. So let's just start there. I think politics is salesmanship and certainty, and science and medicine require nuance and uncertainty and a willingness to accept wrongness in a way that politicians can't do that. That's they're really opposites in many ways, and so it gets a bit I get a bit uncomfortable mixing the two. Having said that, there are circumstances in which it isn't entirely necessary to mix the two, because otherwise things can go very horribly wrong. And I think so, as somebody who's campaigning on an issue, you do need to get political support for change. And then Asim is really good at that, and he has a lot of experience in that because he's been doing it a long time around the issues with statins. And he's a great speaker, and he got a standing ovation for his talk. So it went down very well in the room, and he is very good at getting mainstream media attention, and he did that as well. And I think this sort of talking about the royals is not something I would have done, because apart from anything else, talking about any individual in these circumstances, I find really, really tricky, because on an individual level, it's much harder to say what's going on. But if you want to engage emotions, that's what's needed. You need a story. And then talking about the royals seems really particularly tricky, because they can't speak about this, and they're not free to speak about this. So yeah, that's a tricky choice to have made, but it got him the coverage that perhaps he was looking for. So I'm not going to tell him what to do. That's the way he chose to do it. The other interesting choice he made, I thought, was to talk about cancer rather than heart disease, because he's a cardiologist, and we have got tons of information around the harms caused to the heart by these vaccines. So I think everybody now pretty much has heard about the myocarditis, pericarditis story, which was horrific, but it's a tip of an iceberg. So, with myocarditis, you cause heart cells to die, and they don't get replaced. The heart scars when cells die. And if you've got a scarred cell or missing cell in what is a very delicate electrical conduction system, you can have short circuiting, and that will continue as a risk lifelong. So what may have been a unnoticed inflammation in the heart that caused symptoms that were ignored or didn't cause symptoms pretty much at all could still have a clinical impact. And we have seen that, unfortunately, in there being too many cardiac arrests, in there being too many sudden deaths, and in there being too much sort of excess mortality overall that was in the cardiac category. So we've got a really, really strong story about these products causing large numbers of people to have cardiac harm. And he chose to go with the cancer story. And the cancer story is more nuanced in that the overall levels of cancer in the population as a whole are like 1% higher than they might otherwise have been in the past, and some of that will be aging. And the overall picture, actually nothing's going on. But when you dig down into subgroups where you could see a signal more clearly, like 15 to 44-year-olds who don't have so much background cancer, then you do see that there has absolutely been a rise in cancer mortality. And there's lots of reasons why that might be, because these products cause a lot of inflammation, they damage the immune system, and they potentially have this genetic component going on as well. So there's mechanism and there's evidence of harm, but it's just not as clear-cut a case to make a big campaign about. And we absolutely need it investigated. So I'm all for people raising those concerns and saying, look, this is something that needs to be looked at, because young people are dying who otherwise wouldn't have been. It's awful. And there are also individual stories of particular cancers that seem unusual, or or the kind of correlation that Angus Dalgleish was seeing between the timing of boosters and the recurrences of cancers, as if the immune system's been hit, which we know it is hit, and then the cancer comes back. So it's a very emotive topic, and he's taken it on, and he seems to have been sort of potentially cancelled over it.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
He mentioned Professor Dalgleish, and Professor Dalgleish, I remember reading a lot of his articles in the Daily Mail, so therefore he was respected in the mainstream. Dr. Malhotra also has been very respected in the mainstream, being a TV doctor and things like that, and coming on and discussing things. So these are two individuals. It's not like maybe someone else, will not say any names, but is on the edge of acceptability. These are fairly central. So I guess in this way, ReformUK, they did their homework in getting someone who is respected, not only in the UK, but across the Atlantic. And I guess his speech would have gone through the ReformUK office. They wouldn't have anyone coming to speak, so they would have gone through it. So this was not a topic they didn't want him to raise, which I find it intriguing, especially when you look at Nigel's stance during COVID. Give us your thoughts on that, and maybe this change that we are seeing at the moment.
Okay, so I don't think we can expect to have politicians who are seers, who get everything right all the time. I think we have to be realistic that they will make mistakes. And what we should be looking for in a politician is somebody that listens and then changes their mind and then acts. Those are the qualities that we need, not some kind of, Superman. That's not realistic. Now, with Nigel Farage, I know he's very, he is clearly a very good politician. He's very good at the politics. And he's in a position at the moment where he doesn't necessarily need to appeal to anyone. He needs to just sit tight at the moment. So he
basically not say anything for the next 4 years.
Yeah. And so, that what Reform have said about a theme was, we're for free speech, and we're giving someone a platform because we believe in free speech, which I think is a bit undermining, and is a little bit kind of rude to a speaker that you've invited to sort of distance yourself like that afterwards. But we do want someone talking about free speech. I think that is really, really important. And if we've got the kind of fundamentals back in place around free speech, then other things would start to correct more naturally. The problem we've had over the last 5 years is that the systems of democracy broke. We lost our free speech, we had no political opposition, and the media stopped working. And when that happens, of course, things are going to go catastrophically wrong. And you've got to fix those things before you can get to a place where you can correct. And politically, it's quite hard to correct if you haven't got public understanding and public support. And that has absolutely grown over the last 5 years. And I think some of the people in power at the moment are really, really behind the curve on this. But it has to be that way round. It has to be the public understand this and they have an issue with this and they want something done about this. And then the politicians can act on it. And obviously, that's not the only way things can be done. You can have proper leadership. You can have ethical, principled leadership that says, we're going to do this for these reasons. I'll listen to your complaints about it, but this is a direction of travel because it's the right direction of travel. We haven't seen that kind of leadership for a long time in this country. And so, we've got used to this sort of the public says something and the politicians are kind of following, which isn't necessarily great, but it also isn't the worst kind of leadership, because the worst kind of leadership is ideological and driven and not listening. So, I imagine that Farage is not going to want to embrace this topic because he doesn't need to. But he's just invited or just managed to persuade Danny Kruger to join his party. And Danny Kruger is somebody who is not a scientist. He's a historian. And during 2020 and 2021, he was voting for restrictions in his speeches, talking about it being with a heavy heart and understanding some of the implications of what he was doing. But I think, as without a science background and with the advice from the media saying what they were saying, it's very hard in that position to say, no, you're all wrong. But he did listen, and he has made some, he has understood the issues. He's completely understood them, and he's spoken in Parliament about them, and he's spoken up for the vaccine injured. He's spoken up about the compensation scheme. He's spoken up about civil liberties. So he has listened and understood, and that's the kind of politician that I think we deserve as a public. Somebody that just listens, changes their mind, and then acts on it. And so that has been really encouraging to me. And I think Danny Kruger is somebody I would absolutely vote for. And now he's a reform politician, which
let me, because I have a lot of respect for Danny, following him from afar. Someone who is very vocal for their Christian faith in a chamber that has largely forgotten that and rejected the concept of Christian foundations. So I want to get to Danny, and of course that huge move over to Reform and leaving the Conservatives. But one other thought on Asim Malhotra's speech. I mean, I saw you made the comment there that they said that we don't endorse him, but we do believe in free speech. I mean, they had Lucy Connolly speaking at the conference on free speech platform, someone who was jailed for what they said. And I haven't watched her speech, but I'm sure it was all about the freedom to say something and the freedom to agree or disagree. But I'm just intrigued because Malhotra was brought on not for a free speech. I mean, you don't invite, when I was in UKIP, when we were organizing conferences, you wouldn't invite someone to speak who opposed one of your policies completely just for the first sake of it because you believe in free speech. It's you bring people who believe in your vision for the country. So to say that we don't endorse him, well, why did you invite him if you don't endorse him? And that's kind of I know Reform don't want to get into trouble in terms of what they say in the public sphere, and you're right that they're coasting for a huge victory. But maybe this is a change in Reform's thinking, in Nigel's thinking. That's kind of what I'm intrigued about. They didn't invite Andrew Bridgen because he wouldn't have been accepted there, but Asim Malhotra is accepted, and his concerns maybe do resonate with some of the Reform voters and supporters? Sorry, that was a long statement. I'm sure there's a question there, but your thoughts around that?
Well, I think one of the, I think perhaps they are trying to align with people that do care about these issues. They are saying to that demographic, we want to represent you, while at the same time saying to the media, you don't get to take us down on this topic. And of course, between now and any election, I mean, obviously we don't know when that might be, but I can't see it being anytime soon. Then we've got what's happening in the States. And in the States, they are sort of setting out a pathway, and they will be exposing more and more to the public who haven't yet really got to grips with this topic about what actually happened. And so, I think if you've got somebody like Bobby Kennedy, who is doing an investigation at the moment into deaths in children, for example, that those kinds of topics are going to change people's minds about what happened there, and the rest of the world will be swept along with that, because it's just exposing the truth, right? You can't. It's not. If you're just producing evidence that had been hidden, and then they sort of show people, well, look at this and look at that and look at the other, then that is going to take the whole world on a trajectory, and we will be on that trajectory too. So I think, I would love to see us leading on this, right? That would be brilliant for us to be leading on this, but that's clearly not going to happen in the current environment. If we can be the first to follow, I think that would be a win. And, I think that's also entirely possible, because there are certainly a lot of countries where they haven't had as much pushback as there was here. We did manage to push back brilliantly here. We have, far fewer vaccinated children in this country than in comparable countries because of campaigners. So, I do think that there is a louder voice here on these issues, even though the media don't ever help amplify those voices.
So, I mean, I think, and you're right, I think RFK Jr. is a gift to the world because of the work he's doing, and that gives President Trump maybe cover for him saying warp speed was so wonderful, the most wonderful, the greatest, the whatever he's going to use. And I guess Nigel, with his relationship with President Trump, I don't know if he knows Bobby Kennedy, but I guess that is a natural. You're right; it's a natural progression as Bobby Kennedy exposes not only the damage of some of the vaccines, the link me to autism, which is supposed to be out this month, but I think is delayed by maybe a number of months to get all the data. I mean, he seems to be doing a thorough job. It's not just a rush to get out a tweet in a month. It's doing a thorough job. And I'm intrigued. We could have Nigel Farage as Prime Minister in 2029, the next election. That's what we're projected to, although 4 years in politics is a long time. So it could be that Nigel adopts and is ready to adopt a lot of the findings coming out of the US.
I mean, that would be marvelous, wouldn't it? But the thing is, you need the infrastructure. Like, having a politician saying, we've got this problem or that problem isn't enough if you've got a drug regulator and a medical regulator and a medical profession as a whole who don't understand the issues and aren't trying to make things better. So, there is a big piece of work there. And Andy Bridgen and I have previously argued about who'll be last to figure this out, whether it'll be the House of Commons or the NHS. So he thinks the politicians will be last, and I think the doctors will be last. And I really do think the doctors will be last, because they have, they have sold it. They have injected people with it. They have bought into the whole idea of it as being a good thing in principle and that cannot be questioned. And those are really hard barriers to overcome. And yeah, I mean, I know a lot of doctors, and they're not close yet.
But I think the last people to realize it will probably, I think it'll be Angela Rayner and some of the Labour MPs who are so slow, seemingly generally, at anything. So maybe it'll be that. But you mentioned the NHS, the health system, and I think there was a line from David Bull. David Bull had said, or it was in the article, the Guardian article that I'd talked about at the beginning. Reform UK dissed himself from Malhotra. As a David Bull, Reform UK party chairman, introduced Malhotra as someone who worked with me to write Reform UK's health policy. What does that mean in terms of, because we don't have a Bobby Kennedy that's actually transforming a health system. Maybe we will by the time of the next election. It seems though we just want to throw more money at it and hopefully cross our fingers that may make it a little bit better and you've got an 8-month waiting list instead of a 9-month. But that having someone like Malhotra kind of inputting into the policy papers of reform, maybe that also means there's possibility for change. I mean, how do you, as a doctor, you've worked in the system, how do you see the possibility of maybe changing it to be a health service that works much more efficiently?
I think it was David Bull that said that comment and that theme. And there's this thing about politics in the NHS, isn't there? That saying, "Oh, we're going to change the NHS" was in the past a sort of election winning thing to say. So we're going to make this better, we're going to revolutionize it. And then there came this period, which we've had for some time now, of saying we're going to leave it alone, because these revolutions kept sort of causing more harm. But I think that period has gone on for too long now, and there is so much broken about it that even the people who support it the most have a lot of criticism to say about it. And I think the economic model is a tricky one. The fundamental problem, though, is a cultural one, that the culture, I think because it's a single employer, it's monolithic, and it's very hierarchical, which creates kind of, systems for bullying. The whistleblowing systems don't work. They're all set up to sort of catch people who've fallen rather than stop them falling any further. And those things are really, really tricky to change, because the only way you can really address those issues is to say the fundamental problem is that we have a single employer, because that stops people talking, it stops whistleblowing, it stops correction of harm. And we can't have a health service that doesn't have really good systems for standing up for patient care and patient safety. We don't have that. And so then you start talking about, well, how do you stop it being monolithic? Well, then that means breaking it down. And as soon as you said, well, we're going to change it from a single state-owned structure, you come up against huge opposition, because you're going to privatize the NHS. That's, the kind of buzzwords that would kill election prospects. And and I'm not sure people are, I'm not sure how I feel about that myself. I don't know. So I think that having free at the point of delivery and different providers is a model that most people could get behind. And I think that what we've seen up until now with privatization has always been creaming off the economically most, viable work and leaving the NHS to pick up the hardest work in any particular topic. And that's really not the aim. It shouldn't be the aim of the game. And there are also other issues within the NHS that are cultural, like the assisted dying thing that's going to be coming in, and like the sort of protocol-driven systems that we have, where doctors are not feeling they've got the power to properly advocate on behalf of their patients. Because if a patient comes to you and they tell you your story, you fit into a particular category, and for that category there is a protocol, you must do this if that, and you must do this if that, and you feel that's not right for your patient, if you can prove it in the paperwork because of a particular thing, you say, well, it's okay, that's not right for you because I can show them this and I can show them that, then you can deviate. But if you haven't got the evidence base to deviate, it becomes much harder to do so, because you're then actually acting outside of the framework that's been given to you, and you could be accused of malpractice because you're not doing what you should be doing for the vast majority of patients. So without the evidence base, you can't act in a patient's best interest, and that obviously is not in a patient's best interest, because there are circumstances where, you know, the one size fits all, or even 2, 3, 4 sizes doesn't fit the patient that's in front of you. And, you know, without having a one-to-one relationship like that with your doctor, where you can have a doctor who is showing you humanity and ethics and care, rather than just a kind of chanting you through an algorithm like a robot could, then what's the point of having a human doctor? And so then, you know, obviously in the most cynical sense, you could say, well, that's why they've driven it down this route, because it's a perfect lead up to displacing doctors from care. But I don't think anybody wants to see that. You know, I think patients want to have a human relationship. They want to have a relationship where they feel they can build trust. Now, even if that decision making is assisted by AI one way or another, to have a qualified doctor who can talk you through, who can explain things in your language, is something that I think sick people deserve to have, right? You know, I want to have a country with a healthcare system that is peopled by real people with humanity. And that's what I know, that I think that whole idea of why do we need doctors and healthcare professionals, what are they bringing, and how important is that, needs to be discussed, and it sort of hasn't been. And unfortunately, because of the last few years, people have lost trust with the NHS and have lost respect that they used to have huge respect for healthcare staff, and that's diminished.
Claire, can I ask something different we hadn't discussed before, but it was to do with the league tables that have come out in terms of the trusts, and for the US viewers, the UK has broken up into these trusts, which are, I think, geographical, and it's like you're told now how good or bad your hospital is. I think basically that's what it is. But to me, it's like being told that all the restaurants in your area are good or bad. I mean, if they're all got a hygiene rating of 1, then either you can risk it there because you live there, or you can maybe get in your car and drive for 45 minutes and go to one that's better. It doesn't seem to give the patient choice. It just tells them whether the area they live in is a better or worse area health-wise. Is that a fair assessment?
I think in some respects it is, and in other respects it still has a benefit, because if you if you are running a department, you ought to have your work audited against other departments. So you ought to know if you're falling behind by one metric or another, and there might be really good reasons for falling behind. You know, that like the sort of those examples of cardiothoracic surgeons who are taking the most difficult cases in the country because they were the ones that were best qualified to deal with it, and so obviously had a higher mortality rate as a result. So, you know, there's always complexity in that. But if you understand why you're an outlier, that's okay. But if there isn't a reason to be an outlier, then you need that feedback. I think that feedback is really important. So I guess then the question becomes, well, how much of that is useful to the public? And that again comes back to a trust thing. So I think openness is really good for trust, really important. But on the other hand, what it could do is undermine trust in a way that isn't quite right, like the example I just gave about the cardiothoracic surgeons. And I think, you know, I think openness overrides that. I think openness is important. But I do think that patients sometimes feel they're not given choice in the system. And then, of course, if you do have choice, it becomes like the school system, doesn't it? That some people have got much sharper elbows, and then those people worry much less about the system because they're all right, gov. So, you know, there is tricky, that one, isn't it? Because you want people to you want it at least to be accessible to the people who need it most.
Well, it's true. Well, no, the choice is, if you really need to see a doctor very quickly, you can pay a lot of money, and if you don't need to see, then you don't have to pay. So the choice seems to be based on what you can pay. But can in terms of vaccines, um, with, of course, many people, Dr. Malhotra being one of many, 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 and yourself raising concerns with the work being done in the US with Bobby Kennedy and the reports that are going to come out. In the UK, of course, we had a COVID inquiry that did not much apart from give the legal people a ton of money for running it. But in terms of vaccine, where are we? People are suddenly aware that these are not what they're billed as. The safety is not built in, and no one's ever read the side effects, and suddenly those are now more available. Um, and it could take forever to read the possible side effects. Where are we then in terms of vaccines, in terms of the safety of that, and how does that affect kind of health going forward? How have you seen kind of overall the last 5 years? Where are we now compared to where we were before?
So I would say we've got to a position now where I think most people would agree they were not 100% safe. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people still think they were very, very effective. So this whole kind of 20 million lives saved lie has really got embedded. And they will say very openly that it was worth the risk. That people seem to think that, well, so some lives got sacrificed and we've been really mean to those people, but that's okay because it might have saved someone else, which obviously is unethical even if they had worked. But I do not think they did. I don't think they worked. And so I think that's a really, really important part of the whole safety question is, you cannot brush it under the carpet under a benefit risk type balance. And the reason I say that very, very confidently is really quite simple, which is that we've seen, viral waves, right? Viral waves come and go. They take the same length of time to peak and the same length of time to go away, and they're still coming and going, right? So this is not something that we can keep measuring it on and on and on, and it's repeating. And the peaks are always one in winter, almost always one in autumn, sometimes one in spring, and sometimes one in summer. But the thing is, it follows a pattern in terms of what time of year you expect to peak. So you can say, well, that's what we should have expected in 2020. Why would 2020 be any different to any other these other viral waves and any other influenza? Because influenza is exactly the same thing. And the point is that when an influenza or a respiratory virus or a coronavirus comes, not everyone is susceptible to it. That's the way it is. We've got brilliant immunity. Our lungs are lined with mucus that a virus can't get through. So something has to go wrong before you're susceptible to it. And the susceptible proportion in a wave is about 10%. And we know it's 10% because if you measure people in a household and say, well, if someone comes into the household with it, how many of the people who were not with them when they caught it then catch it? So you can do a measurement of that. And Public Health England did good work with that, having spent however much it was, 37 billion on test and trace. But they did get the data out, and the data was really, really clear that it was, actually it was a bit less than 10%. It was more like 8% in each wave were susceptible to testing positive and being sick afterwards. And then they also tested blood donors, and they said, well, let's look at how many have got antibodies to COVID. And you can see it go up by about 7%, maybe more like 6%. It's about 6% with each 6-month period it was. And you think, well, there's a difference there, right? You've got more susceptible than are getting antibodies. But I think that difference probably is entirely the antibody test and how sensitive it was to picking up how many people had been sick. Because what you see mathematically is that the virus has worked its way through a population and it's found all the people, and then it's finding it harder and harder and harder to find them, and then it can't find any more. And then all of those people have had it, and then it goes away, and then the next one comes along. So if you look at that, you say, well, look, that is what happened. That's the evidence of how this stuff works. So therefore, we go back to 2020 and say, well, what would have happened if we had done nothing at all? Well, that's what would have happened, and that's exactly what did happen. That's how many people were affected, and that's how many people did get antibodies. So lockdowns did nothing, and then we've got lots of other ways of showing lockdowns did nothing, but that's another way into it. And so once you've shown that once you say, well, what would have happened without the vaccines, then you can say with absolute confidence the vaccines didn't change anything, because the same thing happened with the vaccines. And of course, there's loads of other ways to measure it, comparing countries and comparing regions. And when you start to do that, what you end up seeing is that what the vaccines did do was, although the hospitality waves and the death waves were the same size, they did not, the cases increased in 2022 with Omicron. So then you've got more COVID from the extra cases, the same number of deaths. And you can twist that and say, look, it's killing a smaller percentage than in the unvaccinated, but only because you've got more cases. That's not really a benefit, is it? That's twisted. Now, having said all of that, what's really tricky is that the UK is an outlier in the data. So the UK, Portugal and Ireland had a very flat, stretched out second half of 2021. If you look at the whole 6-month period, the number of hospitalizations is the same as any other 6 months, the number of deaths is the same. What was different, we didn't have the acuteness of the spike. It was more stretched out. But I don't think you can look at those 3 countries and say, well, that looks good, didn't it? That looks great. And then say, well, why did it not work across Europe as a whole? Why did it not work in the USA? You can't just cherry pick and say, well, it worked there, therefore it worked. And then the final piece of the puzzle is that people say, well, when you looked at the age groups during the vaccine rollout, you saw that the hospitalizations stopped in the oldest and then stopped in the next and then stopped in the next. That did happen, but people haven't stopped to think about why it was happening. And it was happening because these injections hammer the immune system. That fraction of susceptible people end up getting their infections earlier than they would have done. And so because they've had it earlier, it's over. And so you see it being over in that group and then over in the next group. But just because it's over doesn't mean that overall you haven't had the same number of infections and hospitalizations as you otherwise would have done. And actually, we did have. So that's not a benefit. Making it all come at once so that you don't overwhelm the health service. I mean, how ironic is that? If you make it all come at once through a vaccine campaign, that is not a benefit.
Let me ask you just one last thought. We hadn't really discussed this, but you mentioned about patient's choice, and I think often people find when they went and they got a jab of something that most people I talked to had no idea, those who got it, what they were getting. And I guess there was just a batch come in. I'm also thinking of the autism review coming out. And if it does say that actually the MMR jab does give you an increased risk, and yet it was even difficult for some people to get single dose. I think when he had Andy Wakefield on before, he said because of the contract agreements with the company that made it, and makes you wonder how much of it is financial inducements. And I know we are very different than the US, but I'm wondering, is there choice for the patient? But the drugs that are used, I guess that's a contract between the trusts and drug companies, and I guess then individuals and maybe even doctors don't have the choice of what to give. It's interesting. Maybe your thoughts on how it works a little bit, just for the viewers to understand what role they play, and are they just been giving a drug because that's the contract and that's the most money can be made from that, as opposed to it may be better for them.
We don't have the same financial inducements as the USA. We don't. But there are still financial inducements. There are still fees, and there was still money to be made. But I think it can be very, very hard within the system to say, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to participate in that. And especially when you're surrounded by colleagues who, like, genuinely think they're saving lives doing it. So, there's an awful mountain to climb to explain to them your reasoning behind not wanting to do it. So a lot of, that's about who's really making the decisions and how, and the decisions are very much top down, and there wasn't room given to having those conversations. And in fact, of course, the other problem is, if you say anything negative about a vaccine in our culture, you are a blasphemer against what turns out to be the national religion. And so, you become a heretic and you just get cast away. And so even people who might have a niggling thought that there's something more to think about won't want to go there. Like, not just not speak it, they don't want to think it. Because if you think it, you become one of them, and you can lose your career. So literally, there's a barrier within people's thinking before it ever comes to sort of self-censoring around it.
I mean, how much freedom do doctors have? Sorry, one other. I'm curious. How much freedom do doctors have? Because I know I think for maybe a doctor can choose, if they're involved in something, whether to may carry out an abortion or not. Maybe that's a moral decision. That's maybe slightly different. But in terms of, could a doctor say, actually, I don't want to use any mRNA jabs, I just want to use the Johnson & Johnson, for instance? Or could they say, actually, we're not going to jab pregnant women, I make that choice? Where does the ability for a doctor decide what they give and what they choose to give?
So there used to be a lot more freedom. And what's happened is that in order to save budgets, those decisions have become much more centralized. And so there will be hospital policy on using a particular drug for a particular condition. And there will be clinical, like GP commissioning group policy. And so the freedom for any one doctor has been massively reduced. They literally told you can't prescribe that, it's too expensive, or so then you don't have a choice. You'll be told that's the condition, that's your drug. And there are pros and cons to that, obviously, because I think part of one of the issues they were potentially trying to address with that was marketing from pharma to individual doctors, which is something that could go really awry. I can see that. But all it's meant is that the pharma now have a much smaller group of doctors they have to market to, who are actually making the decisions and then pushing it down to everyone else. And well, you just made it easier for them in some ways. So, what we don't have enough of is feedback the other way. We don't have a sort of open forum of people saying there's a problem, there's an ethical issue, or there's a medical issue, and I want to be able to raise it back. And so one of the big sort of things that we could change, I think, and that would be an easy thing to change, a very easy thing to change that would make a big difference, is to say we have to start looking at drug safety in the other way around. So in a clinical trial at the moment, what happens is efficacy and safety are both treated with the same statistical tools. So you'll say, right, we want to know if this drug works. So as a scientist, when you're asking that question, you have what's called a null hypothesis. So you say, well, we'll assume that it doesn't work, and then use statistics. And only if we've got the numbers to prove that it does work, then we'll say this is a drug that you can use. And I'm fine with that. The trouble is we use the same approach for safety. So they say, we assume this drug is safe. And then do the statistics to say, well, have you proved it's not safe? And that's obviously so obviously the wrong way around. Every drug has a side effect. All of them are unsafe at some level to some degree. So we should be saying this drug is unsafe. Can we show that it's safe enough? That should be the statistical bar that we should be using. And there are ways to do that are totally usable, especially with AI. So the statistics is harder to do, and medics are not statisticians. They all know some statistics, and if you're involved in trials, you know some statistics, but they're not statisticians. So you don't want to give them really complicated stats. But with sort of AI calculators, we're now in a position to be able to do that. So that instead of saying, well, the chance that this was a sort of more than a 5%, if this was a safe drug, would this have happened more than 5% just by chance alone, or less than 5% just by chance alone? That's the question we've been asking. And so, when instead of asking that, we could ask the question, well, what is the chance that this is a signal that this drug is unsafe? And say, is that on the balance of probabilities unsafe, instead of, is it beyond reasonable doubt unsafe? And so then the whole thing gets turned around. And so that what that would mean, for example, the children's trials had too many seizures in them, and it wasn't statistically significant by the first measure. But if you have the other measure, the answer you would have got is do more testing. The trials were tiny, they were just far too small. And so there should have been more testing, and that should have been the statistical answer to that. And there was good evidence that actually, indeed, they do cause seizures. And that's astonishing that we've got to a point to be able to say that, because actually our post-rollout drug safety monitoring systems, they're not good enough. They're just not good enough. And in a world where we've got great big, data systems and ways of collecting data, we should not be afraid to demand much bigger trials, so that you're in a situation where you say, okay, we've tested a drug and we think it's safe enough and it is effective to pursue at the next level. The next level should be within the NHS, a much bigger trial, because the original trials are never designed for safety. They can't be. And therefore, when a drug is first used, everyone who is first using that drug should be part of a blinded, randomized, controlled trial to get a proper measure for safety. And the bizarre situation we've ended up with trials is that they get finished early when they show a signal for efficacy. So the ethics people come in and they shut it down and they say it works. It's now unethical not to give it to the placebo group. This is insane. This is the world, like seeing the world through an entirely pharmaceutical lens of drugs do no harm. We all know drugs cause harm. And if we're not measuring the harm properly, that is unethical. And I think, if you're going to do experiments on people, to cut those experiments short, destroy the safety evidence, that is unethical.
Claire, I really appreciate that. I think it's helpful to the viewers to understand a little bit about what happens. And even though we're years on from the start of the COVID tyranny, we still have that same push for drugs, and big pharma still there making a ton of money, I guess, from our sickness, or their induced sickness. That's another topic. But yeah, Claire, really appreciate you coming on and sharing with the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter.